Good afternoon. Welcome to the Public Leatherworks. If you've not heard of us, I'm not surprised. We are one of the best kept secrets in Colonial Williamsburg. Up until very recently, we've actually been a transient shop. If you'd visited Colonial Williamsburg in the colder weather months, you would have found us keeping shop in the back of the Public magazine. And in the warmer months, you would have found us keeping shop in the Public Armory next door to the blacksmiths. Today, however, we have found a permanent home in what used to be the bindery building. When the binders moved upstairs to the post office building, we've moved into their old space. So here we are. Historically, we don't know where the Public Leatherworks was located in Williamsburg. It was a government shop. In fact, if you've had a chance to see the Shoemakers live stream from a couple of weeks ago, they'll have told you a little bit about what the Public Leatherworks was all about as a government workshop, going and making things for the Virginia regiments fighting the war for independence. Here we are today. I'm Jan Tilley, our journeyman artificer here in the Public Leatherworks, and with me is Mr. Howlett, the master of the shop.
Did you?
Yeah, so thank you so much for welcoming us into your shop, both Jan and Jay.
Sorry.
We're very, very glad to be here at the Public Leatherworks. And of course, we'd like to open up the floor to any questions that we have from our viewers out there on Facebook. But first, we want to start by asking what you've been up to in the shop lately.
Well, there's never a dull moment around here. The work is incredibly diverse. Could be leather, could be fabric, could be felt, or even rope from time to time. We just last week finished off a cooperative effort with the bookbinders and the blacksmiths, reproducing some of General Washington's portfolios. That was pretty exciting. We have been on and off for the last maybe 2 years making components to a British light infantry impression that a donor has been funding for our military programs. People, as a matter of fact, I think you have a picture of Ian in his uniform. Can you put that up and let folks see that? And so we've been doing quite a few pieces to that, the knapsacks, the cartridge pouches, bayonet belts, and has been a lot of consulting back and forth. It's been pretty exciting to do.
Excellent. Well, we would definitely love to hear a little bit more about those collaborations as we go on. But now maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the tools that you use in the shop.
There are probably 3 tools that I'm going to use for every job that comes across my bench, no matter how large or how small. I really can't do anything without my round knife, my dividers, and a stitching awl. And I think you probably got a close-up that's probably easier to see than me waving the things around, do you? I can't, like I said, I can't do anything. Let me give you a real brief primer on how those are going to work for us. Like I said, the round knife is my principal cutout tool, and the dividers are my principal layout tool. Dividers probably not that different than what you got in your math kit, back in elementary school. In the case of mine, though, rather than having a marking device or a pencil, it just has 2 legs, and it has a set screw so that I can open that up to whatever width I want it. Let's say I want a piece of 3/4 inch strap. I'm going to set my dividers up for 3/4 inch. And check it against the rule. Calibrated eye works again. Got 3/4 of an inch there. And then I can use it to score a line onto my leather. And say that's not cutting or anything. That's just making an impression. But that's going to be enough that when I pick up my round knife, I can just follow that impression. What I'm going to do is I'm going to score it. I'm not going to try to make a cut all in one go. I'm going to make light passes, gives me better control over the knife, keeps me from making mistakes, and keeps my fingers attached to me, which I've kind of grown accustomed to. So once I've cut my strap, I can also use my round knife in a different way to pair. And I'm going to get back here a little bit, and I'm going to pair that off. Can you see that, Justin? Mm-hmm. All right. But see, I can reduce the thickness, and that way, when I fold it back, say like this, where I'm going to put a buckle onto it, and I don't want that abrupt edge, I can thin it down and get it to lay in there almost imperceptibly. I can also use my dividers to lay out stitch lines. just like I did to score that strap, but I can set them for the width I want the stitches apart, or the length of the stitch, and use it to mark those out. And then I said there was 3 tools that I'm going to have to use almost on every job. The other one is a stitching awl. And the stitching awl is simply a metal point on a wooden haft. It allows me to brace it against the heel of my hand and use it to very easily push through the leather. Okay? Now usually I'm going to do that as I go and pass the needle and thread through so that everything lines up. But that's just so you can get a sense of how that's going to go ahead and work. And like I said, big or small, every job I'm probably going to use these tools on.
Excellent. Now, Tammy was wondering if local Williamsburg citizens were those people who really did the labor in this type of shop and how they kept up with the demands of soldiers here in Virginia.
Honestly, the makeup of our shop is kind of a mystery to us. We know historically that there were 16 or 17 individuals working out of the shop. We know that 13 of them were soldiers assigned here as a duty station. We know that there were 3 civilians. The only person that we can name by name is actually an enslaved man by the name of Davy. Davy was the property of Matthew Anderson, who was the superintendent of the public Leatherworks. And the only reason we really know about Davy is because we have records of Matthew Anderson drawing wages for Davy at the rate of a shoemaker. So we're not really sure if it was local folks here in Williamsburg who were working in the public Leatherworks. Like I said, we have a great deal of information and very little knowledge about the place itself. Today, in the modern world, there's 3 of us working out of this shop. There's myself, Mr. Howlett, and we have an apprentice, Andrew Warren. And together, we're pretty representative and doing representative work of what would have been happening here in the public Leatherworks.
Excellent. Now, Ian was wondering, sort of similarly going off of the topic of the American Revolution, how the public Leatherworks really operated with shortages of supply during the American Revolutionary War.
Well, that's a common problem that we do encounter in what we know about the operation here in Williamsburg, and in fact in all of the government shops. I mean, this is just part of a huge network of such shops that were set up not just here in Virginia but throughout the fledgling states. And because the nation at the time of the War for Independence really is a nation of farmers, we're agrarian, we work on farms and plantations, we just don't have an industrial infrastructure that we can rely on to generate anywhere near the volume of material we need. And so supplies are going to be a constant patchwork problem here in North America. We see it again and again and again. We hear all the myths of the War for Independence. One of them that we hear so constantly is that the soldiers being tracked, Washington's army being tracked by their bloody footprints in the snow, and it is absolutely true. I mean, there's just no way around it. Without the alliances that are made by people like Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin with the French and the Spanish with the Dutch, I don't think there's any way that we could possibly have achieved independence.
Now, Mike and Kevin both brought up interesting questions about what type of material you're actually using to create your leather. Now, what are these types of supplies that were actually needed?
That is a fantastic question. It's a question that we get a lot in the shop as well. And really the short answer is that the job that's on our bench is really going to dictate what materials we're going to need for it. I really think that one of our big modern disconnects about the 18th century is the level of specialization that exists out there. For example, there's no such thing in the 18th century as a leather worker, but there are about a dozen trades that you could apprentice into and work with leather as your primary resource. And as you can imagine, if you're a bookbinder, you need a certain type of leather that's going to be completely useless to a harness maker, and their leather is going to be useless to a shoemaker. So not only have these consumer trades specialized, now all of the ancillary support trades that are supplying their materials have to become equally specialized. So when a job comes across our bench, we have to look at not only what type of animal we're getting our leather from, but the age of that animal. What part of the body does it come from? Certain parts of the body are going to be thicker or thinner or stretchier and have different properties to it. How has that leather been processed? How has that skin turned into leather? Has it been tanned using tannic acids that are found in ground up tree barks and vegetation? Maybe it's been what they call whit-tawed or alum-tawed using aluminum sulfide. Or maybe it's been oil dressed using fish oils. All of that's going to give that leather different properties and be good for different things. And finally, has it undergone finishing work? Maybe it's had to have waxes and oils and dyes infused into it to give it certain properties and make it ideal for certain jobs. Maybe it's had to have been compressed to make it dense and tough. So all of those factors have to be taken into consideration when we're choosing leather for a job that comes in. So like I said, really it's the job on the bench that dictates the type of material and type of leather we're going to have to use.
And we've had several of our viewers also ask about the coloring processes for your leather. So how exactly is the tanning process being done here?
Well, sometimes the color of the leather will be dependent on the kind of process that actually converts it chemically from skin into leather. Vegetable or bark tanned leathers tend to be sort of a warm brown color. If you oil it, it will deepen up and patinize to deeper browns. Whit-tawed leathers tend to be white, and oil-dressed leathers tend to have a yellowish cast to them, sort of like, think your car chamois, because a true car chamois is actually an oil-dressed leather. Anything else is going to be done artificially, and that's typically going to be done by a professional rather than by the manufacturer. Typically, if the leather is going to be colored, it will probably have already been colored by a courier before it arrives here to us. And they're using things like lamp black to blacken it, and that seems to be far and away the most common artificial color. But you do, from time to time, find colored leathers, and these typically are coming from Morocco, Algeria, and it's a process that's specific to them, where they color the leather actually in the tan pots, and that seems to be the only part of the world they do that in. And as such, we see this kind of leather, these colored leathers, pretty commonly being used by bookbinders and people making small case goods, not so much for this type of work that we're doing here.
Excellent. Now, Doug had a question about maintenance of these leather goods. Now, would it have been common if something broke for it to be mended, or was it more common just to make an entirely new item?
A lot of that has to do with proximity of where you are. Again, this shop is concerned with supplying the military. So everything that we make is going out to be issued out to soldiers, and those soldiers aren't sticking around here. So in the case of shoes and things like that are being made, they get issued out to the soldiers. The soldiers might end up in the Hudson Valley of New York. They might be heading down to Charleston in South Carolina. They may be headed out to the western frontier. And so if anything breaks, it's really not cost effective for them to send it back to us to be mended. So most of what we're doing is manufacture. Now, when it comes to things like maintenance, if you're a soldier in the field, you're probably going to be issued something called black ball, which is basically beef tallow, beeswax, and some of that lamp black as a coloring agent. And if you think of that as kind of a solid shoe polish, you're going to be on the right track. So a soldier is going to probably be blackballing his shoes, working that in, getting them up to a good shine. Also doing the same thing with his cartridge box. And what that's going to do is not only keep the soldier busy, because as we all know, a bored soldier is a dangerous soldier, but it's also going to be maintaining those leather goods. That the tallow is going to feed the leather, the beeswax is going to seal it up and make it a bit more water resistant, and that blackening agent is going to help keep the color of it.
Now, you've touched on this a little bit, maybe from a periphery perspective, but we were wondering, and Ruth specifically asked this, if you could explain why you were called the Public Leatherworks.
Sure. You'll notice a number of places around town here today in Colonial Williamsburg that are called Public, the Public Armory. And that simply denotes a government operation, like your public schools or your public libraries.
And following up on this,
Pardon.
we were also wondering if the Leatherworks, as a government institution or as a government operation, would have participated in non-government contracts.
Short answer is we don't really know. It seems that most of everything that's coming out of this shop is specifically for the use of the military and the government. We found a little bit of a gray area in there as well. We know that most of what's being produced here is going into what's called the Virginia Public Store to either be issued out or bought up by officers. We know that in several cases, Matthew Anderson is having his workers use the scrap leather that's left over from shoemaking to make children's shoes, smaller size shoes that can then be sold to support the war effort. And we've also found a reference to a couple of pairs of ladies' shoes being made and 2 pairs of women's shoes being made for the governor's daughter. That being in 1778 for Patrick Henry's, probably his oldest daughter, since she's the only one who would be old enough to be wearing women's shoes at that point.
There's also the gray area. Mr. Finney, who is the quartermaster for the state, keeps an office right near the current day armory, and it looks like the Public Leatherworks is doing some work on his private vehicle. But the assumption is he's probably using that chair of his, that private vehicle, in government service, pursuing his duties as quartermaster.
Now, both David and Angelique have brought up questions about leather breeches, and I think actually we have some pictures that you might be interested in talking about a recent project.
Yeah, why don't you? Can we put the picture up? Good, great. That's probably one of the reasons that we exist is probably 20 years ago when I was still an apprentice in the saddle shop. I got interested in leather breeches, and I started asking questions, and very quickly I got led on a secular chase with the same information that I knew just enough about leather to know probably wasn't correct. And that sort of sent me down a rabbit's hole. And I got lucky and was able to get a grant through an organization called the Early American Industries Association. And that allowed me to do some field study where I went out and really examined closely quite a few pairs of surviving leather breeches. And I'm lucky they do survive. And then I came back home and began to try to replicate what I'd seen. In 2000, and I think was it 14? Was it 15? In any case, about 5 years ago, one of the tinsmiths, Joel Anderson, came up with a scheme and a program to create leather breeches for the armory staff. And I was able to hire a couple of interns, and we spent the summer at the armory making one pair of leather breeches after another pair of leather breeches. And it was really very, very exciting to be able to do it time after time. And it also was something that I think really gave this shop, as you see it today, a foothold because of donor interest in it. There were a couple of people who got interested and really extended that project and let it become a lot larger than it initially had been. So we were really fortunate, and that's something I love to talk about. So when you can get here, come talk to me about it.
Now, building off of just general ideas of manufacturing and how you recreate these goods from the 18th century, are you generally working from patterns?
Yes and no. A lot of the time we're creating our own patterns. For example, last year, due to donor funding for this 80th Regiment Light Infantry impression that they're doing at the Public Magazine, they commissioned us to do some cartridge boxes. This is an example of one of them that we made up for them. And we were fortunate enough to be able to go into our own collection here at Colonial Williamsburg and examine a couple of original pieces that I was then able to take measurements off of and kind of reverse engineer how the whole thing's going together, and was able to draft patterns to a certain extent off of that. But it's a one-off, and it's not something that's probably going to be made by us again. And so keeping a lot of different pattern pieces on hand is not something you're going to see us doing. And historically, I think that a lot of the time what shops like this are doing is they're having a piece brought to them and say, here, copy this, we need 500 of these, and we'll come get them when you're done with them. And so it's really up to us here. Our main job really is to be able to take that original piece and be able to look at it and turn it into a modern reproduction of it.
Now, returning to the 18th century and how the public leatherworks operated during the American Revolution, do you think there's one item that would have been most popularly manufactured here?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. The most ephemeral piece of equipment that a soldier gets issued is shoes, footwear. I mentioned earlier, the legends of Washington's army being tracked by their bloody footprints in the snow. A soldier puts incredible hardware on a pair of shoes, and the scheme for replacing soldiers' necessaries like shoes and shirts and stockings actually calls for soldiers to have those resupplied quarterly. So 4 pairs of shoes a year for each soldier. Today, in the present day Leatherworks, we make very, very few shoes. In fact, I have a philosophy that shoes are like sandwiches, and it's always better when somebody else makes them. So we really rely on our shoemakers to do shoes, but it is part of the apprentice curriculum here. You have to make a couple of pairs of shoes, and I promise you, making a couple of pairs of shoes does not make you a shoemaker. It does allow you to talk about the process with a little bit of authority, though. But it is not the anticipation of this shop to churn out shoes anywhere near the rate that our historic counterparts did.
Now, both Jack and Amanda have brought up questions about maybe leather goods that women would have used in the 18th century. As the public leatherworks in the 18th century, would you have been making goods for women? And also, as the leather shop today, are you making any leather goods for our interpreters here in the historic area?
Today, a lot like most of the other trade shops that you might have a chance to visit here in Colonial Williamsburg, most of our work does stay here in the foundation supporting other programs. Case in point, this work that we're doing for the Public Magazine to support their programming. Historically, the Public Leatherworks as a government institution really isn't at liberty to sell anything. Everything that you would see in the shop, whether it's our raw material, whether it's the finished product, even the time of the workers working in there, it's already owned by the state of Virginia. So there's really no leeway for them to take on specific other projects. As far as leather work specifically for ladies, there really isn't anything specifically for ladies that I can think of a leather nature. Today, obviously, we think of things like purses and things like that. But that's not something you're seeing in the 18th century. And I think that today we've kind of got this idea of leather as being this exotic and luxurious material. That's just not the case in the 18th century. Leather is a very utilitarian material and not something that you are walking around bragging about. Today you've got a nice leather jacket, you go out and you show it off. In the 18th century, leather is just what you use when you need something that's going to perform the job that it needs to do.
So you might have actually just answered this question in this answer now, but Christian was wondering, given sort of the prestige that leather has, maybe from our modern point of view, were officers of the 18th century using different types of leather goods or different leather materials than, say, private soldiers?
Probably the biggest difference in the leather articles that the officers have and what the troops are being issued is that the officers are having to purchase their own. And so there isn't anywhere near the level of uniformity for say sword belts or exactly what kind of shoes or boots an officer is wearing like there is today. So they may have, if they care about it, they may have gone out and bought very, very expensive leather goods, but I don't know that the leather quality is necessarily that much higher. I don't think there's a great deal of difference. Leather is a utilitarian material, just like Mr. Tilley just said.
And now pivoting to an item that we can actually see in the camera shot here, Ian was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Congress cap that you have out on display.
The Congress cap is really kind of an interesting story. a couple of years ago when I first started my apprenticeship with Mr. Howlett, he gave me the project of researching Congress caps. There's really not a lot of information known about them, not a lot of written information. I was able to track down several images, contemporary images of Congress caps, and I kind of took it upon myself to recreate one. It wasn't a pressing project on the bench, so it kind of got done in stages. And actually, just this year, I was able to finish assembling all of the pieces parts. Talked to our curator of machinery and numismatics, Mr. Eric Goldstein, who was gracious enough to do the paint job on it for me. And what we see now is a finished Congress cap based on a couple of contemporary images. And that's basically the story of the Congress cap.
Still a real mystery who got issued, though. We don't really know what units. They seem to be a thing in the American Army for a brief period of time in the main Army around 1776. If anybody runs into any information about that, we'd love to hear what you got to say.
Absolutely.
Now, returning to the topic of accoutrements, Richard was wondering how available buff leather was in the colonies, and if you could speak a little bit about its use both in the Continental Army and maybe even a little bit in the British Army in the 18th century.
It's pretty much a standard in the European service. It is very, very scarce here in North America, to the point that pretty often when you're looking at antiques, it's a tell if it has a buff strap that it is probably European. And it's not ironclad. Nothing about the War for Independence material culture is, but it is very scarce, and we see an awful lot of stop gaps being done. Things like painting tanned leather, or even covering leather with light color fabric. A box made in Philadelphia recently was auctioned, and it had a linen cover over the sling to ape the appearance of having that white buff leather strap. So it's very rare in American accoutrements, and it's practically universal in English and continental accoutrements.
Now, as the public leatherworks here in Williamsburg, were there specific units as a part of either the Continental Army or the Virginia establishment that you were specifically catering to?
Basically, the public leatherworks is established, much like the public armory and whatnot, to serve the Virginia regiments. Now, whether those are Virginia regiments going into continental service under General Washington, whether or not they're state garrison regiments and things like that, we're not entirely sure where the issue is going to. Most of what I'm finding in the public store records is items being put into the public stores. And from where it's going from there, we're not really entirely sure. But it is for Virginia troops. One of the big problems that arises just in general with supplying the Army is that it's not something that we've ever had to do before. We've never had a full-time Army in North America that wasn't British. And so when the War for Independence breaks out and we find ourselves faced with this obstacle of supplying a full-time professional army, the Continental Congress doesn't have the wherewithal to do it. So along with requiring certain levies from the various states based on population, they're also requesting a certain percentage of supply for those troops come from the various states. So that's our understanding of where our supply is going to as far as Virginia troops go.
Excellent. Now, we do have time for one last question. And for this one, we'd like to ask you both, what are maybe some of your favorite projects that you've worked on here at the Public Leatherworks?
I think one of the most interesting type of projects that we get to do is when we're called upon to reproduce an actual surviving piece. A lot of times, when if somebody asks about patterns, a lot of times we have, a contemporary piece that sort of lives in a vacuum. It doesn't have any chain of provenance. It just is what it is. It's the object. In a perfect world, we have a golden trinity. It would be, we would have the object, we would have some sort of contemporary written source describing, that article, whether it be the receipt for purchase, or we had a contemporary image that showed a like article in use. Often we have, one of these. We might have the piece and not really know anything about it. Several years ago, I had an opportunity, though, to reproduce General Washington's portmanteaus, which were these huge, huge sausage-shaped leather bags, probably used for bedding. And the museum that contracted us to reproduce them actually owns one of the original. It's the Museum of the American Revolution up in Philadelphia. And that was really exciting because we had not only the surviving article, in fact, there's another one in the Smithsonian Institution that also belonged to Washington, but there's a contemporary illustration of Washington standing in front of his tent, and there's one of them under the table, and there's a number of different pieces of archival information that list those particular pieces of luggage. So that was really exciting to me to work on that. And of course, it's always exciting when we have an opportunity to touch something that belonged to somebody as famous as General Washington.
Absolutely. Excuse me, please. As Mr. Hallett was saying, we really like to be able to get our hands on original pieces and things like that. A lot of the times people ask us what our favorite thing to make is, and a little tongue-in-cheek, I like to reply, something I've never made before. If something that we've never seen before comes across the bench, it's an exciting challenge and an opportunity for us to really get our hands into something brand new. And for me, that opportunity came about a year and a half ago. We got contacted by Mount Vernon to reproduce some of General Washington's canteens. And in this case, canteens are referring to pieces of luggage that carry the general's condiments and cookware, his bar service, his tea service, coffee service, things like that. And as Mr. Hallett was saying, we were able to travel up to Mount Vernon and actually get our hands on this original piece that belonged to General Washington, take pictures, get measurements off of it, and then be able to reproduce it for them to be able to display and actually have guests be able to come up close and personal, not with the actual item, but with an accurate reproduction of it. So things like that, reproducing original items, and again, as Mr. Howlett said, having that provenance of this was owned by General Washington, really does kind of send a little chill up the back of your spine there.
Well, thank you so much, Jan and Jay, for welcoming us into your shop today. As we finish up, we would just like to take this opportunity to thank our donors. Programs like this are made possible by the generous support of viewers like you. And to learn more about how you can contribute to our programming, please follow the link in the comment section below or visit our website at www.colonialwilliamsburg.org. Jan and Jay, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with today?
Yeah, we can't wait to see you when we can open the door and let you back in. We would really much rather have you here where you can feel it, where you can smell it, where you can actually experience Colonial Williamsburg and historic trades with us. And, we've talked an awful lot about donors, but we can't say enough. It's not the big $1 million folks that keep us afloat. It's people who maybe buy us deerskins or have extended internships that have allowed shops like this to continue to flourish. Thank you.
Absolutely. Just as Mr. Hallett said, we're really looking forward to the day that we can welcome you all back into our shop and actually see you and talk to you and interact with you, and you can see us and pick up and feel and touch and taste and smell the shop that we've got here. It really is a tactile environment, and we can't wait for you guys to be able to come and experience that for yourselves. And also, to echo what Mr. Hallett was saying, big, huge thank you to all of the donors. We really can't be doing what we're doing today without your help and your assistance, and that goes for every guest that comes in and buys a ticket. You're helping us keep on doing what we're doing today and helping us do what we love to do.